So this is part of a series of videos on intelligence analysis skills that I think are useful and valuable and maybe change how you think about analyzing situations and making predictions and forecasts. And this is one of several examples that I'm pulling from The Thinker's Toolkit by Morgan D. Jones, which is a really fantastic book, and I would encourage everybody to go and purchase it. I'll be kind of running through one of the scenarios he talks about and then sort of talk about how I've adapted it for my course on US foreign policy and some of the maybe extensions that you can take to this kind of analysis. And Jones has sort of this foundational kind of example that he sort of plays out throughout the course of his discussion of utility analysis. It's built around this sort of idea that you've got a person who has to make a choice about which conference to attend. There's a conference in New York City, there's a conference in Florida, and there's a conference in Vermont. And one way that I think most people would just sort of approach that would be to say, well, I like New York. I'm going to go to New York. But utility analysis says, well, let's put a value on that. Like how much joy, how much utility, how much goodness do you expect to get by going to New York City? And you can say, oh, well, New York City is my favorite place on earth, so I'll call it 100. And then you can maybe ask, well, what did Florida look like compared to that? Maybe on the same sort of scale. And you can say, well, Florida is nice and everything, maybe 50. And then you could say, well, what about Vermont? You're like, well, 20. I'm not as excited about going to Vermont, right? And so you could look at that kind of analysis and say, well, clearly I want to go to the conference in New York City. And making a table doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense, but there are some maybe other factors at play in our calculations that are fairly easy to map out in a table like this that maybe helps us to sort of refine and think about our calculations about what makes for a good choice. And so one of the things that Jones suggests is like, well, when you're making those utility calculations, what are your assumptions about the conditions? You might realize like, oh, I assumed that it was going to be nice and sunny while I was at the conference, but that's maybe not the case. It might end up being rainy. And if it's rainy, New York's still great. There's, lots to do. I might not spend as much time walking the streets, but, there's shows and restaurants and good place to be. I really don't want to be in Florida. If it's raining, like that sounds miserable to me. The promise of beaches and sun and all that is gone. So that's a much less good experience. Likewise, Vermont. If I'm stuck inside of Vermont, this is not a good idea. I'm going to be miserable. So I can maybe adjust my calculations to take into consideration two different possible scenarios. I could even go a step further, and Jones does go a step further and says, well, what do you think the probability of it being cold and rainy versus warm and sunny is? And so maybe I could add those probabilities in, that I'm expecting a 30% probability of it being warm and sunny in New York City, but a pretty good likelihood, maybe I'm going in, I don't know, March or another cold and rainy month. I'm expecting that to be the case in, so 70% likelihood for New York. And so I can actually like multiply that out and say, well, if 30% of the time I get my 100 and 80% of the time, or 70% of the time I get my 80, my overall utility that I might expect is 86. Now, in reality, I'm only going to get either sunny and 100 or rainy and cold and 80 from a trip to New York, but I can't know that in advance. And so I can kind of price in those probabilities by weighting them against my utility. And I can do that for Florida, where I might expect it to be more likely to be sunny because, it's Florida, but it's still possible that it'll rain. And Vermont, where it's maybe a 50-50 flip, whether it'll be warm and sunny or cold. And again, so I can weight those through and get these sort of adjusted probability values. And it hasn't really changed my calculation all that much. I'm still going to choose New York as the destination that gives me the highest utility. But what if it's not just me making that decision, right? What if I'm bringing the family and my wife has preferences about this because she has family in Vermont, and my kids have preferences about this because I guess Disney World is in Florida. And so I might want to replicate this whole analysis for myself, for my wife, who again really would like to go to Vermont, and for my children whose preferred outcome is Florida. And we can sort of do all of these for each of them, and we can end up finding out that we have different preference orderings. And if I just sort of averaged everything out to try to figure out sort of what would be, right, I just kind of mapped it out, I could see that, we're in disagreement. Well, then I have to figure out the next question, which is how do we resolve this? And so one thing I can do is I could think about whose preferences are most important. Which of these preferences am I going to care about? I could just say it's just me, because I'm going to the conference. This is about my work, and I'll just go with me. But maybe I want to factor in, other people as well, and you can choose different weightings for this. So in Jones's example, the attendee is weighted at 0.8, and the spouse's consideration is 0.1, and the children's consideration is 0.1. And so he goes through and remultiplies those utilities by those weights and gets adjusted expected utilities that reflect those different competing valuations of the situation. Again, still choices for New York, but it's not quite the slam dunk that it was before. Okay, so hopefully this makes sense, right? We're just mapping out our choices. We're maybe considering different possibilities of what might happen. We're thinking about people who have different values, and then we try to figure out how to balance that. What does this have to do with making a policy choice or an informed policy choice? And I'll just kind of shift the example and kind of talk this through with in terms of how I run this in my class. So in my class, I do an analysis of how to respond to Hezbollah taking hostages in the 1980s. And the United States might have two competing goals that we're trying to achieve, right? And we're maybe trying to deter Hezbollah from taking more hostages, and we're trying to free hostages. And those are two different goals, and any policy is going to look very different to those two different goals, right? So just blowing stuff up might be an effective deterrent, but it certainly doesn't rescue hostages. That's not unlike the situation that Jones has sketched out about the attendee, the spouse, and the children all having different valuations across these different possible destinations or these different possible policy options, right? And so thinking about policy situations that have maybe competing or contradictory ends that you're trying to achieve can be really hard to balance. And this can be a way to sort of map this out and say, well, this policy works really well for this particular goal, but it's not helping us at all over here. And so that's one way that you can do it. You can take it a step further and use this kind of analysis to price in risk. And so just as Jones priced in that it might rain and you might not get the utility you wanted, we can price in, is this policy likely to work? How likely is it to succeed? And I can sort of make those those calculations. I think this policy has a 30% likelihood of success. And just like we did in Jones's analysis of taking the preliminary weights that we had for utility and multiplying by the probability that it'll be a sunny day or the probability that it'll be a rainy day, we can multiply our sort of assessments of how good this policy will be for this particular goal. How likely is it going to work to achieve that goal? And that can really change our calculations, right? Suddenly, policies that were not great, but were pretty reliable, start looking much better than policies that promised us the moon, but couldn't deliver because they were very low probability of success kind of things. It also can allow us to weight different goals differently, right? And so if you're President Reagan in the 1980s trying to figure out what to do about Hezbollah's hostage taking in Lebanon, you might care a heck of a lot more about freeing the hostages than sending a strong diplomatic signal that hostage taking is a bad thing. Right? Maybe that's your priority. And maybe just as how Jones said, well, the conference is about me, I, the attendee, should have my preferences weighted at 80, and my wife or spouse and children should be weighted at 0.1, 10% each. We can do the same thing here. The most important thing in terms of our policy goal is freeing hostages. That gets a 0.8 weight. Deterrence is a 0.2 weight, right? And so that, again, that sort of allows us to work with these multiple different things that we're trying to balance. but to do it in sort of a systematic way where we acknowledge the assumptions that we're making and we sort of put them front and center, and allows for us to maybe have that conversation about risk, that conversation about what's really important, that conversation about what are the goals we're trying to achieve, and to do that in a very systematic and overt way, and a way that forces us to sort of wrestle with the assumptions that we're making, and a way that makes those assumptions transparent to other people. And so if I'm saying a particular policy, sending in a SEAL team to try to rescue hostages from a building, if I think that has an 85% chance of success, but military planners sit down with me and say, actually, given the layout, given the situation, it's probably closer to 30%. That's good to know. And it's good that we have that informed conversation about the assumptions that we're bringing to the table, and we check those against people who maybe have better information to bring to bear. Now, there's a critique against this entire approach, which is that it is reductionist in its reliance upon rationality, right? That the idea that we're all just sort of making these cold calculations, this sort of utility maximizing approach. This is, I think, a common critique of game theory in general, that says that this isn't how human beings actually process the world. And so if you're using it for yourself as a decision-making tool, great. Use it as it is. I think it's useful to sort of have those conversations. But if you're using it as a tool to understand or forecast or predict how somebody else might act, maybe we want to build in some non-rational elements to this decision process. And I don't mean non-rational in the sense of arbitrary or crazy, just non-rational in the sense of not I'm blanking on my word, the kind of rationality that gets assumed in game theoretic models. Okay, so one of those ways that we can build in non-rational tools is to add in sort of a polyheuristic exclusion. So polyheuristic theory says that there's just too much complexity in the world. We can't analyze everything. And so when we're trying to be rational, oftentimes what we do is we just sort of use shortcuts to sort of exclude entire classes of decisions, right? So when I'm choosing a restaurant, I don't go through Yelp and look at every restaurant in town. I sort of make a categorical judgment. I want pizza. I don't want tacos. I don't want hamburgers. I don't want, Chinese food. And I just sort of exclude all those restaurants. And then I have a conversation with myself about what makes for the best pizza. We can sort of build that into this kind of analysis, right? Maybe I'm going to completely exclude a certain set of policy options, right? I'm just not going to look at any policy option that involves military force. Boom, gone. And now we can have the conversation rationally about sort of everything below that. Or maybe we can exclude just out of hand any policy that isn't going to be highly visible, right? Maybe there's an urgency pushing a policymaker to be seen to do something, and so doing nothing or using back channels or something that's not going to get a headline. I put sanctions on a bank account in Switzerland that I suspect is linked to a terrorist organization. That's not going to capture attention, and therefore I can just simply in this analysis say, let's just wipe that out, and now we have a conversation about things that sort of fit our initial criteria for selection. Another way to build this in is to build in discounting. So discounting is something that economists will talk about as people's tendency to value a dollar today versus more than a promised dollar in the future, right? And so if I gave you the choice, if I gave you a dollar today or a dollar in the future, you take the dollar today. If I gave you a dollar today or $1.25 in a month, would you take the $1.25? We can maybe price that out and say there's a point at which you find waiting that extra month to be no big deal. We can build in discounting into those calculations, just like we built in risk by multiplying it by a probability. If we value immediate action, we just count that as 1. If something takes a year, maybe we weight that at 0.9. So kind of an arbitrary number. Depends on how severe you think the discounting is. If it's going to take 5 years, maybe we discount it a lot. Maybe we multiply it by 0.3. Right? But again, what it's trying to do is it's trying to sort of build in systematically and say things that are immediate are valued, things that take longer are not are going to have to be overall better policies for us to sort of wait to achieve those goals and those gains and those results. Another thing that you can do is you can build in risk tolerance. And so we know that some decision makers are very risk averse. Other policymakers are very risk acceptant. And so if you are facing a policymaker who is risk averse, when you take that probability of success, I think there's a 0.8 probability of success for this policy, you could just square it. It sort of double counts that risk, right? So it'll turn that 0.8 into a 0.64. I think that's 0.8 times 0.8. Yeah, 0.64. And that would be a way to build in. A policy has to be very reliable for me to be comfortable with it. Or you could not build in risk calculations. If you have a policymaker who is risk averse or who's very risk acceptant, maybe you bump up all of your risk calculations, your probability of success by 0.1. Maybe you take the gap between the probability and 1 and cut that in half and then add it back into the probability. There's lots of mathematical ways you can do it, but the basic idea is if you have a leader who you know is risk acceptant, factor that into your analysis. And so there's a lot of possibility with this kind of a framework, both as a way of sort of saying, I want to be systematic in my own decision making, make my assumptions explicit, but also in terms of trying to understand and anticipate how others might be navigating really complex decision processes and try to understand what is maybe motivating them in terms of the goals that they're working with, their non-rational kinds of calculations about current versus future gains, risk tolerance, or just blanket dismissals of certain classes of policy options. And I think that can be a useful window for analyzing how a leader operates, thinks, approaches situations, which can maybe give you insights into how you might respond in future situations.